I'm David Pinsoff. Who are you?
I am David. Dave Pietrzewski.
And this is Evolutionary Psychology, the podcast,
Yeah,
which features actual
evolution,
evolutionary psychology by.
actual evolutionary psychologists.
Keep on
I was
listening.
gonna say, and also listened to by actual evolutionary
Yeah,
psychologists.
we listen to it as well.
Well, I've gotten a lot of feedback from actual evolutionary psychologists saying that this is actual evolutionary psychology, and so the actual extends to a third place where people who are listening, not everyone.
Yeah, actual, evolutionary for evolutionary psychologists, you might
Yeah,
say.
for actual evolutionary psychologists. And you know what? You could be an actual evolutionary psychologist even if that's not your day job. So there
Yeah,
may be like three or four places. We're not going to change the tagline because we have enough trouble with the two elements
yeah, we're barely holding it together on this one.
of easily not holding it together at all. So without further
Okay.
ado, let's move on to the next portion of the thing you're about to listen to. We'll see you in a second. David, some people describe themselves as old souls, and some people, so like they're sort of in a young body, but they feel old, and then some people who feel young but are. Wait, did I get that wrong? We might have to
Yeah, they,
start
they
that
they feel
over.
young, but they actually are old in an old
Yeah,
body.
of those
Yeah.
two, which are you?
Oh, I'm definitely the latter. I feel like a child in an adult man's
Okay.
body.
All right. Well, I'm bringing this up because today we're going to talk to Mike Gurven. And Mike Gurven, what he studies, and he is an anthropologist at UC Santa Barbara, is the lifespan and life stages, and really sort of if there's evolved design for the different life stages, which I think is a really interesting and sort of profound and weird question to ask because we often just sort of think about, growth and then development and then wearing out as sort of this ballistic process and not necessarily as like the reflection of evolved design for different life stages.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mike Gurven is a pioneer in the space, studying human development, human life history, what old people are for, and why we evolve to live to old age. We also get into a bunch of other interesting topics in this episode. We talk about heart disease and ill health in modern societies, and why small-scale societies might not be susceptible to those health problems. We get into personality variation. We get into the demographic transition, why we're not having as many kids, whether we should have paid parental leave. It was a really fun, wide-ranging conversation.
Yeah, and in Mike's book is going to be out in September, on September 16th. So if you're listening on September 16th, please go run out and buy his book. It's called Seven Decades.
Yep, 7 decades. Check it out and
Yeah,
enjoy the episode.
here we go. Okay, we're recording. I'm super excited to have Professor Mike Gurven, who is in the anthropology department at UC Santa Barbara. Anthropology at UCSB is now integrated anthropological science. Mike, is that right?
Yes and no.
Okay.
Anthropology, as you know, has gone through many different transformations over the years and different institutions. And so there's always been the multiple wings, archaeology, cultural anthropology, and then the other, which is
Right.
variously named biological anthropology, evolutionary anthropology. We were biosocial anthropology for a long time. And then at some point, like around 2008, we said, all right, we're just going to be integrative anthrosciences. So that it draws an umbrella kind of cross-cutting subdisciplines, right? So cultural anthropology can be scientific too. It
Mm.
doesn't necessarily always have to be evolutionary. And so,
Mm.
yeah, that was the sort of logic, integrative anthrosciences. And so it's called a unit, but the university still doesn't quite understand what units are. And so there's been a push to maybe get rid of the units and just be all one big happy anthropological family again.
Right.
So yeah, it's like it's a particle, it's a wave, it's both.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I think we have this issue in psych a little bit. Oh, sorry, David. Just like even where like, you might be asking social questions, but using neuroscientific methods. And so I have colleagues who do that in the neuro area. I have colleagues who do that in the social area. It's like these bureaucratic distinctions that sort of fall apart scientifically.
Well, I thought it was hilarious. I once had a wet lab in the neuroscience building. And I remember at one meeting, I was like, I'm a little uncomfortable. I'm not, I'm like the only non-neuroscience person here. And someone asked me, do you study behavior? I'm like, well, yeah, of course. Oh, then you're a social neuroscientist. So I was
Right.
like, all right, yeah.
Yeah. But we will get into the fact that an anthropologist, and of course, there are many anthropologists at UCSB who have wet labs. So we'll get into that. But David, you were going to say something.
Oh, I was just gonna do a an awkward segue into your research and your upcoming book. So you mentioned that the anthropology unit is one big happy family. You do research on families and on how families interact with one another across generations and horizontally within a generation. And you have a book about that called Seven Decades. So if you could elaborate, what are those seven decades? Which decades are you referring to? And why are they important? Why should we care about them?
Yeah. Well, thank you. So here
Oh,
it
that's
is.
beautiful. Ooh,
Uh,
who took that photograph?
I have no idea.
Okay.
It's people assume it's someone, it's a photo I took or it's me like in 5 years, but no, it's a stock photo.
Okay.
a
All right.
photo of a guy. It's unclear whether he's like smiling or grimacing in pain, or it's ambiguous what his emotional
Well, it's
state
kind of like
is.
the eyes test, I think.
Uh-huh.
You're
He looks
supposed to,
kind of happy.
the person is smiling,
Yeah.
Okay.
but some people who tell me, why are you such an angry person on the cover? I'm like, okay,
It's a
Yeah, I'm getting a
Rorschach
bit of
I learned
test.
a
anger.
lot, a
Yeah,
lot
it's a
about
Yeah.
you.
Rorschach. Yeah.
Uh, yeah. Um,
But this book just recently came out. Is that right?
Yeah, well, technically, was it the 9th? In 1 week from today, it's available
Oh, great.
out
We can
on.
publish this. We can just release this. So probably by the time people are hearing this, it will be out.
Okay.
But so what date is it free? When
Yeah,
can
and
people pick it
so
up?
it's the pre-order people that
Okay.
I guess are
Are
starting to
seeing the
get it
angry
right about
faces.
now.
They're starting
Yeah,
to see the angry. But sorry, you said September, mid-September is when
September
it's
16th. So one
September
week from
16th. Okay,
today,
great.
coming out. It should be. I guess it'll be available at the bookstore.
Yeah. Hey,
Maybe.
maybe if I get my act together with editing, maybe I can quick edit this and we'll just put you up and cut in line a little bit and post this
Oh,
next week. So we'll try to
okay.
do that. Yeah.
Great. Oh, so sorry, David.
Sorry. Yeah, we're
You
Yeah, so what are
we're
these
going
seven
into this.
decades
yeah.
that you've written an entire book about?
Yeah. So it's funny you say that. I mean, I guess a good title, right, should be kind of, you may have a sense of what I want to say, but not exactly. And depending who you are, I've had people write me already and be like, are you saying I shouldn't exist because I'm 83 years old and beyond 7 decades? And one of my old advisors is, in his early 70s now. And so, he read this like nervously, like, what are you gonna say? So yeah, part of the idea about 7 decades is essentially, an argument that, our species typical kind of body is kind of built to last about 7 decades. And
Hmm.
so over our
So,
long evolutionary history, we would have had that potential to reach 7 decades. Now, notice
hmm.
potential being very different than like an average lifespan that you would expect to see, just because of the way averages are computed. If you have lots of mortality early in life, that kind of crunches down the average to smaller numbers. And because we're not really good at thinking about averages and what they really mean, even some scholars, not just the public, tend to think that over our long evolutionary history, we lived to about 30, 35, and then that's it. And so yeah, that's
Yeah.
kind of where the 7 decades is coming
Yeah.
from.
We
So,
had
so where, yeah,
Chris von
I do
Ruden
see
on.
this
Yeah, we
this
talked about that. Yeah.
misconception. I just see this misconception a lot in like bad pop evolutionary psychology that our ancestors, didn't live beyond 35 or whatever. We had these extremely short lifespans, and that explains all sorts of modern woes. So I'm curious how you would put this bad idea to rest and where you think this bad idea came from.
Yeah, I would like to think that hopefully this book will maybe make a little bit of a dent
Hmm.
uh, against that idea. But the thing is, the idea itself, though, it's understandable maybe where it comes from, right? That because it's not just the fact that it's not just thinking about human survival, but it is also thinking about fertility, right? So if you've got lots of babies, then all else equal, your population pyramid probably going to look something very triangular. And so the overall percentage of older adults living in the population is going to be much smaller than even if survival is relatively the same as say it is now, you're still going to have a pyramid like this. And so it gives that idea that there's just not that very many old people around at any given point. And of course, once you just reduce fertility, the pyramid starts to look more and more rectangular. So it's easier to see a lot more older people. So I think, that kind of contributes to this idea that it's sort of new because we are living longer, but our fertility has reduced quite substantially all over the world. And so we're definitely noticing that there's more and more people, over the age of 65 in our society. And so we tend to think, that things are always different now than they used to be. And so we kind of forget that, yes, even though survival has been improving, it's not the case that just those folks didn't really ever exist. And I think there's other arguments, I think, why this perpetuates. Oftentimes when you see the life expectancy was like 25 or 30, that's all you hear about. You don't really see any more data or hear any more information. And certainly the skeletal record's pretty spotty, and so it's hard to even age skeletons that might be much older. Um, Everyone loves to quote Hobbes, right? That life was nasty, brutish, and short. So again, all these kinds of ideas sort of perpetuate this idea that this we really didn't have old age, and and particularly the problems of old age that we now see in the news every other day. So how are we going to pay for Social Security? Where are all the caregivers going to come from? Alzheimer's is going to skyrocket. And again, these are all sort of portrayed as new ideas and new problems. And so part of the push that I'm trying to make with this book is that it's a quantitative difference. It's not a qualitative difference, that we've always had old people with us. True, survival has improved. And so we are living longer now than we've ever lived, before in the history of our species. And there are more older people around than have ever been before. But it's a more than as opposed to there wasn't and now there is. And I do think that difference matters because this is where the anthropology and the evolutionary part comes in, is that, I believe that part of the reason for our species' success is having middle age and older age life stages as part of our species' typical design. And so I'm trying to harness some of those arguments for, we did it once throughout our evolutionary history. And so let's try to take uh, those adaptive benefits of being alive at middle and later ages, and let's kind of transform the way we think of the older adults as a burden and think of that as untapped potential, untapped opportunity. So that's sort of the push that the book makes to kind of bring home the contemporary message.
Yeah, I think it's the idea. I mean, we've talked in this podcast so far about design mindedness and thinking about evolution producing design. A lot
Mm.
of the design we've talked about has been psychological, sort of real time contingent design, or even, something like how does a plant grow, or, how does the mind respond to a certain situation or motivate certain behavior. What you're talking about is something I think we've alluded to, but maybe not explicitly. And I think it's a subtle and profound point, which is the idea that the stages of life, just in the same way that like a butterfly, is a life stage compared to a chrysalis, compared to a caterpillar. In the same way, there can be design for stages of the life, and it's not that any one stage is sort of just a purgatory, but it's its own point, right? And it has certain design features. So in the same way we can think about the contingent design of software, we can think about the contingent design features of lifespan stages. Is that sort of what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's exactly there. And especially because I'm glad you say life stage because some skeptics have said, well, like a little pushback. Everyone talking about, menopause, postmenopausal lifespan as like somewhat human uniqueness. Uh, but we know that there's postmenopausal kind of survival in other species. But postmenopausal survival is not the same thing as thinking about an actual like life stage. So given that you survive to adulthood, the chance, even in a hunting-gathering lifestyle, that you make it to menopause is way higher than in any of these species that you typically see some postmenopausal survival. So I definitely do think that there's a clear life stage there, and it's exactly right. Part of what I'm trying to argue is well, a lot of it does focus on some of the physical and physiological, but the idea is that with the design of about 7 decades, that should impact everything, not just, immune function, but the mind as well and how we think of it. So I actually do, Dave, I've dabbled in psychology here
Yeah,
and there.
yeah.
And so I had fun kind of tapping back into thinking about some of those kinds of aspects of the mind and behavior in those different life stages.
Yeah, and even I mean the physical stuff I hope we get to because I think there's just so much here that I think is so different. And I assume this is part of why you wrote the book is because there's just so little knowledge, beyond this sort of like eat raw meat and run barefoot and you're gonna die when you're 30. So that's sort of,
Well,
what an evolutionary approach says about physiology, right? Yeah.
well, this is where I kind of thought I did have something to say. I mean, I think like you, uh, my discipline doesn't necessarily reward us for I don't need to write a book, right? I don't need
Right.
the book for tenure. I don't need the book for promotion. Um, but at the same time, I've written enough papers that,
A lot of
uh,
wonderful, incredible number of papers. Like you're very
well,
prolific.
well,
Yeah.
you and 8 other people maybe have read them, right? But it's like, you're getting a limited audience with any paper, even if it's in a top journal, let alone just the little, increasingly reduced word counts. It's hard to tell a comprehensive story. So it's true that there's elements in the book that are like peppered throughout some of my papers, but I think I wanted to do something that isn't in any of the papers and really build out this kind of this argument and then do apply it to our situation today. And it was a little scary because entering the aging longevity health market, it's a glutted market for sure. Uh, but I think or hope that it's doing something a little bit different that these other books haven't done, right? So I'm not really telling you 10 ways, you know, to extend your life, right? I'm not telling you what you should and shouldn't eat and all that. Although I do have a little list towards the end where I cave a little bit, but at least the list sort of makes sense in light of everything else I've talked about.
Mhm.
And, and it isn't, I'm not a molecular biologist, so I'm not focused, on, you know, mTOR and metformin and that, we're on the precipice of living, 1,000 years. So it's not that kind of argument either, and I do think, I don't want to put these other approaches, books down. I think the world is a big place. We need all of these kinds of books and we need the visionaries. But I also think we need to kind of look back at where we've come from. And, part of the traditional medical establishment is basically, as you well all both know, is to ignore our evolutionary past, our evolutionary history. And some people have actually gone and said explicitly that if we want to study aging and lifespan, we need to look at the lowest mortality populations because those are the ones that have eliminated all the sort of extraneous causes of death, and it's all aging. And so that's where you have to look and focus. And maybe for this audience, that seems, how could you just ignore our natural history? How could you ignore, everything that about our lives and how we've lived? And so that's again part of the push here is to kind of shine light on there. And I do think, I probably wouldn't have been able to write this book, 10, 15 years ago, because now that, there are clear lessons of things we have learned that we would never have found if we didn't kind of shine the flashlight uh, outside the context of, low mortality, industrialized West.
Yeah. Yeah. Could you give an example maybe of like what's a good, because people I think are their interest is piqued and they're sort of thinking, okay, so what have we learned? And maybe then we can get into like the backstory of where you got the data, but like, is there an example of sort of what we've learned that we wouldn't have known 10 or 15 years ago, or definitely wouldn't have gotten if we didn't take an evolutionary natural fertility, for example, or hunter forager, hunter horticultural population.
Sure. Well, an easy one, I guess, because I don't want to give away all the
Oh
reveals.
yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, yeah. Spoiler alert.
Yeah,
Yeah,
spoiler. But I mean, the easiest one is just the very fact that, you know, hunter-gatherers don't get heart disease, right? And don't seem to have, Alzheimer's, dementia, either. And there's been suspicions of this before, but I think part of the argument was always that, well, people didn't live long enough to get them, and that if they only lived longer, then they would get them. And in fact, some of the really exciting work, uh, cardiologists and radiologists who, you know, anything they can get their hands on, they throw under a CT scanner, and mummies in particular. And by looking at mummies in different parts of the world, they found evidence of calcification in different arterial beds. And it wasn't just like the rich fat cats, the Egyptian mummies, but even like in the Aleutian Islands, a few cases, and in Peru, Incan mummies, and so which would have been more kind of everyday people. And so that was pretty interesting and revealing. Of course, we don't know what they died of, but we know that there might have been some calcification in their arteries. Uh, and so that sort of led to this idea that, well, heart disease, and particular its most pernicious form, atherosclerosis, that we tend to see, um, that's been with us forever, and which is kind of grim, but it gives a certain view of what aging is too. There's aging, biological aging, there's diseases of aging. There's lots of arguments back and forth. Are those one and the same? But if you think heart disease and atherosclerosis is kind of one and the same with aging as a universal, then first of all, it's what we have to look forward to, right? And it also makes it a little bit unavoidable. And certainly we know that, Dave, you're a healthy guy. You probably eat well and move your body quite a
trying
bit.
to. A 5.5-year-old. It's ebbs and flows.
Yeah.
I'm in an
Yeah.
upswing, but boy, I've been the most inactive I've ever been since having a child. It's wonderful, but yeah,
Well, sitting here, see, this is why I was standing on the balance board here
yeah,
during this podcast.
yeah.
Then my head was cut off, so
I
I'm off
see.
the balance board.
Okay, sorry. We're
Uh,
we're we're reducing your lifespan. Sorry. Thank you for the
yeah.
sacrifice. Yeah.
Well, it's just that we know that, being acting healthier will make you healthier, but still, it's like potential lightning. It can strike us, and then we're doomed to suffer from it. And so what we found, we started like lots of other people had with just basic risk factors, looking at blood pressure, cholesterol in the blood, the easy things basically. And and those are pretty revealing. Blood pressure was kind of low, didn't seem to increase with age. Cholesterol was low. So all that would suggest that maybe there's not a whole lot of heart disease. But again, if you don't always know if like predicts like, in different types of environments. And so making it kind of next level, um, we actually did what's called a ankle brachial index, which is to basically look at the blood pressure in your arms and your ankles.
Hmm.
And if all is good, blood should be flowing nicely all around your body. If it's sort of slowing down, obstructions, it might differ between your arms and your legs. And so, looking at the blood pressure throughout the body, uh, you can basically assess if you've got peripheral arterial disease in your arms, blockages in your arms, your legs, and that's kind of like subclinical atherosclerosis. So it could be like, a decade out before you might see it hit the coronaries. And we found not a single person had, below the cutoff level on that measure. Okay, also pretty instructive. And then going the next route, the next level, to really be sure, because again, from some of this work, we were starting to get a little bit of the attention of like the cardiology world and such, but not really, because you have to kind of use their methods and their technology. And so this is where we actually teamed up with some of those very same radiologists and cardiologists I mentioned that use CT scanners to look at calcification in mummies. And we did this in Bolivia. So, you know, I could bore all your listeners on all the different ways it takes to get people from remote Amazonian villages, to a place, it's not even the town closest to these villages, but a somewhat distant town where the French government had donated a CT scanner some years ago. And
Mm.
so collaborating with the hospital and the social workers there, we were able to use that CT scanner and through imaging of people, we could actually look directly at their coronary arteries. And the amazing thing was that basically we focused mostly like people 45 years of age and up. So it wasn't the case that, well, there are no people again who are old. And it was a decent sample, close to 1,000 people
Oh,
over the age of 45, which by small scale society standards, that's really big.
yeah.
Um, and 85% of people had absolutely no calcification in their coronary arteries. And at first, I was like, okay, this just reifies what we saw before. But I didn't quite realize the import of that because, comparing it to every other population level, data that existed, uh, way more people in way more places, including healthy places like, Japan with much higher life expectancy than we do, there's more calcification in the coronary arteries. And the reason why calcification is such an important measure, because certainly in normal healthy people, it's like the best predictor that you will have heart disease and that there will be, the heart events down the line. And so, yeah, that was sort of an indication. Wow, it's not just like one or two healthy people that are eating right and physically active. This is like at a whole population level. This whole population has basically avoided atherosclerosis. And even of the people who had it, they were over 80 years of age and very likely are going to die of something not at all related to atherosclerosis. So, kind of like the mummies that may have had some calcification probably died from something else. Otzi, the Iceman in the Tyrolean Iceman, had some calcification in his arteries, but had also had an arrow kind of shot in his back. So,
Yeah.
probably that might have
Tomato,
been
tomato. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of an interesting kind of surprising thing that then it begged all those questions. Well, what is it about a hunter-gatherer lifestyle that can lead to a life without heart disease, even well into your 70s and 80s? And then it does bring up some of the fads, of course, but it really, it forces us to really just kind of, all right, can we actually answer these questions scientifically rather than, whatever hobby horse that you happen to focus on, um, that must be the magic bullet. And
Right.
so that, opened up a whole kind of new wave of work too, to try to piece apart, can we actually look at all these different pieces that we think might matter, like what you eat, how you move your body, other infectious critters that are invading our body, our social lives and the level of stress that we have, are we living alone or are we living in, tight communities? All of those elements we basically have been trying to build out over the last decade to try to see
Hmm.
ultimately what kind of matters and what doesn't.
Well, I would imagine that many of our listeners are very curious about the question, how can I not get heart disease? I'm certainly curious about that question myself, as an ape who would very much like to not die prematurely. I'd like to, at minimum, live 7 decades, hopefully more. But heart disease is probably one of the things that might prevent that from happening. So, based on all this research, I mean, first of all, it's a fascinating finding that we don't see this same prevalence of heart disease in these populations that you study. But I got to know what are they doing right that I'm not doing or that we're not doing? How can we be like them? What do you think is the answer there?
Yeah. Well, certainly, you could just walk into traffic and get hit by a bus and you won't die of heart
That's one
disease.
one one way to answer.
But that won't get you to the 7 decades, though.
Yeah.
No.
Uh, yeah. So, I mean, good question. The short, quick answer is I don't have 100% answer. And part of that is because it is complicated. Things don't change one at a time in the way we would ideally want to do as, an experimentalist. And and so on one level, even if you measure almost everything, we're going to be limited by what we can say from one population. And so that's why actually we've been working with another population, the Moseten, who culturally, ethnically, linguistically similar to the Chimane, but given where they live, they've just been exposed to missionaries and uh, somewhat a little bit more peri-urban type of lifestyle. Everyone speaks Spanish, there's stores. And so they kind of represent a little bit what the future of Chimane could look like with increasing modernization, which is sort of like a nice, dare I say, quasi-experimental, what would happen if different aspects of lifespan were changing. And what is interesting is that the Mosatan also have very little heart disease, even though they're drinking a lot more soda, but they're still pretty darn physically active. Because even though they're making money, they're not making money from podcasts, right? They're making money from not yet.
We're in that club too, so
Yeah, that's right. We got to get some more books on that shelf.
yes, exactly.
Um, they're making money from selling crops from their fields. So, which is still involving physical labor. Now, it's interesting. The last 5 years, I've seen an uptick. I was just in Bolivia a few weeks ago, and now a lot more people have, weed whackers and, other, new forms of technology that is going to cut down some of those labor costs so they can increase their agricultural productivity, but using their body less. So it'll be interesting to see if the physical activity might start to shift. But what I would say, the one thing that cross cuts, maybe this isn't too much of a reveal, but there's nothing super special about the Chimane per se as far as small scale societies go. The only thing is that they just happen to be the only one that went under a CT scanner. If we did the same to the Hadza, the Aceh, but the Hadza maybe be 88% for all we know without coronary calcification. And even though technically, the Chimane, as having animal and plant domestication, are mismatched from a hunting and gathering lifestyle. Herders, are a little bit mismatched. But across all of these different small scale subsistence societies, which very likely don't have much heart disease, or if they do at much lower rates than we do, physical activity definitely seems to be kind of central to all aspects of their lifestyle. And and not and there's a good and bad to that. Uh, the good is like, whoa, physical activity. That's not expensive, right? But the bad might be, well, didn't we, we evolved to sort of be efficient foragers, right? So why should I have to move my body unless I absolutely have to? Doesn't that make much more sense? And of course, yes, it does. But the good news there is it's not like you have to run a marathon every couple days, right? That a lot of the physical activity, when you actually put accelerometers on hunter-gatherers and farmers, it's yeah, there is more vigorous activity than probably you or me, but not a huge amount more. The real big difference is just there's a lot of moderate light activity. So it's literally the not being sedentary,
Yeah.
but light activity, which means even you could do a walking podcast, right? And then just by walking, you're getting much more activity. It is true. People ask, is there a magic number? Your listeners probably maybe know that the 10,000 for 10,000 steps was sort of made up uh, at the time for marketing reasons, but the Chimane tend to get about 17,000 steps a day. And that is a bit tough to get with our everyday kind of lifestyle. You have to work at it a little bit, but at least some of the empirical studies seem to show there are kind of saturated benefits, beyond 10,000 steps anyway. And so it's not like you have to get 17,000 steps. But I do think increasing our physical activity, and not just in at the end of the weekend, I go to the gym, but just incorporating it into everyday activities, walks around the block, um, parking when you have to drive, park in Isla Vista, Dave, and then you have to walk all the way over, to campus. Although I always see you walking back and forth to IV for lunch like 3 or 4 times a day. So I think you're getting probably a decent number of steps.
Actually, it's interesting because I used to drive my son to preschool and now he's going to elementary school and I'm biking everywhere. I don't drive
Hmm.
anymore to a first approximation except for grocery shopping. And that's the way it used to be in Germany. And I can say just sitting in the car for about a half hour to 40 minutes a day versus just being on a bike, at least now that I'm, in my mid 40s, it's an enormous difference. And that's not a marathon. That's not even, it's my pulse is elevated, but yeah,
Yeah.
no, anecdotally, like just getting some activity. But it's also an example. I have a watch that tracks steps.
Hmm.
And when I went back to Berlin, where there's public transportation. So, it's a 10-minute walk to the public transportation. Then you're on public transportation, but you're moving around. And then, I was getting like easily 15, 17,000 steps here in Santa Barbara, which is beautiful year-round weather. There's not a lot of places to walk to. It's car culture. It's like institutionally, it's like unpleasant to be a pedestrian in most places in the US, unless you live in New York like David did, or in a city, or if you're like living in Europe or somewhere. And so this also sounds like um, institutional design of the environment situation where you have to make the environment walkable or pedestrian friendly. Um,
Well, I
yeah.
think that's exactly right. And I think, and even going back to our, putting all the blame on us,
Yeah.
that we lack willpower, why can't you just fit in a little bit more extra activity, where it seems to be going against all of our kind of impulses. Uh, that's really hard. There's going to be some select few who are going to be able to do it. But I do think, and this is kind of the approach I have with the book, is thinking about the majority of folks that either don't have elite memberships to gyms or don't necessarily have a drive to want to be physically active all the time and I mean pay so much attention to nutrition that you're
Yeah.
obsessed with what you put in your body and all that stuff. And so this is where I really, yeah, strongly agree that we have to structure our communities in ways that the easier option is the healthier option. From the simplest things as like, what's at eye level, at the grocery store to, yeah, put in a few sidewalks and bike lanes, and you can really instantly, transform uh, at a population level, community level, people's health. And there are initiatives to do this. Probably all heard about the blue zones. There's like these blue zone communities where communities buy in. But as you can imagine, it's not just local governments. It's local businesses, schools, uh, across the board, with transportation, everything to basically create
Yeah.
structured environment where the healthier alternatives, particularly in terms of diet, food, and then of course you want to be able to walk outside and not inhale lots of pollution as well. And so that's again also pretty critical. But some of the initial experiments with doing that, like in Minnesota, uh, there was like a noticeable shift in people's BMI and people's, cholesterol and blood pressure. And even if you were just thinking, from the economic cost perspective, that level of prevention, has huge cost savings writ large through the public health system. So I actually think it's the smart way to go, thinking about the future, as opposed to just thinking only about our health, but then this idea that, yeah, but it's going to be so expensive and there's all these trade-offs. It's like, yeah, it is going to be expensive, but it'll actually start paying for itself through a lot of health cost savings.
Right. Yeah. Penny wise and pound foolish. And that's a really interesting. I
Mhm.
mean, this is also where taking a scientific approach to humans is really interesting because what you're essentially saying, I think, is that it's almost an urban planning issue for our health, right? And that we're sort of not designing our environments. I mean, these environments were not designed at all for thinking about sort of, well, what is the person's experience or what's the like effect on their body. It was for other issues, and of course those other issues matter, but like we can integrate those other concerns too.
Exactly. And certainly well beyond heart disease, right? I mean, just think about, any city that has green space and ones that don't have any green space. I mean, it makes a huge difference.
Yeah.
Uh, Being in parks and having that ability to just kind of unwind a little bit from the grind. Yeah. So I think across the board for just living well, having walkable, livable communities that, yeah, are designed more for people, a little bit less for cars, would be,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah, and it's a good example of taking an evolutionary approach. We talked about this earlier in the podcast, but we kind of got away from it. But it's sort of one of the themes has been if you understand the design of the human phenotype, it allows you to create a more humane uh, context for people to be in. And this is a good example of that. And not just health, but also just like well-being and feeling like, oh yeah, I feel comfortable and safe, and I'm not a grumpy asshole. Yeah, like,
yeah. Well, and yeah. So a whole other kind of big chunk of the book is about the quality of life and not
mm,
just the quantity of life. Uh, and so, and that's where, the thing I mentioned about sort of a rethink about, what are the roles of older adults and again, thinking about hunter-gatherers, there's no such thing as retirement, right? That's something that was like literally, invented, a formal retirement. And not to say that people's activities don't shift over the life course. I mean, of course they do. And it's true that even some people will no longer hunt, for example. I know plenty of older men that no longer hunt, but they still might do some farming. And even the ones that don't do the more difficult aspects of farming, like chopping down big trees, they still go out there with a little machete and clear some of the underbrush. And even the ones who don't do that will at least help with the harvest or help with the burning. So there's still economic contributions. And then, of course, there's contributions across so many different other domains of family and community life, from your advisors, your leaders, your shamans, uh, conflict mediators, your lawyers, essentially. There's so many different ways that uh, you know we humans with our big brains you know, make themselves useful in later ages. And so that kind of reshift happens, but it's not a quick just flipping off the switch, and if we're so career oriented and then all of a sudden you just flip off the switch from your career, it's like what's left? You invested so much in your career that you didn't have a chance to invest in your community. You had kids, but your kids are grown and left. So you're not interspersed with that community anymore. And so then it's like this big gulf, and many, many more of us now, especially we're having fewer kids, we live alone. So now we're seeing, uh, just a big shift in the social structure and just the approach that people are thinking about and, what do they want out of those later years. And so this is where I do think, actually some of these ideas, um, with like so many things, you know, come back to Tooby and Cosmides. That one paper of theirs on the banker's paradox.
Mm.
In some ways, it inspired a paper I wrote 20 years ago about hunter-gatherers and food sharing and how, making it so that others will care for you when you're sick or injured, not just out of the generosity of their heart, but because if you're not there to be kind of productive and useful, then they themselves will actually suffer. So it's in their interest to help you. So, and it's a similar kind of logic, I think, with at late ages. If you're shifting and you're retiring, and all of a sudden you're part of these embedded, communities where you're doing a lot and contributing. And if you all of a sudden you're not contributing, okay, people might love you and have compassion for you and might help you a little bit, but up to what point? Up to what level of need are people going to still watch over you? And especially when they themselves might have 7 kids. And so there's a lot of competing demand on people's time and resources. Uh, so I do think even in, hunter-gatherer societies, there is this sort of impetus to, think about what should you be doing with your life and how should you be using your time in ways that others see as value added. And what's amazing is that the same ideas apply in our society, right? No one wants to feel like they're a burden, right? It's like the number one thing older people say to their kid, I don't want to be a burden. Um, and and so even though like all else equal, if you're receiving and not giving, whoa, isn't that great? It's like, no, you're in a position where, in fact, we even found this. If you're in a position where you're kind of a net giver, your net transfers to people is positive, you're way happier with your life than if you're in the position where you're receiving more than you're giving out. Um, and so I do think even in the case where, we don't necessarily need a community to survive, our minds are still shaped in a way that even though I have all my economic needs met, I still feel like I need a community. I still feel like I need others to need me and to belong to someone, to others in a substantial way. And so I think taking all those ideas to heart really forces a kind of a rethink of what should retirement look like? Should there be retirement? Should there be partial retirement, phased out retirements? There's already conversations like this all over the place and, fierce pushbacks like in France, just changing it by a couple of years and massive protests. Uh, and some of that is even just based on the fact that, well, maybe a 65-year-old today is sort of as healthy as, you know, an 83-year-old, back in the past. And so once you're 65, maybe you could continue working till you were 68, and then retire. So there's that whole element of the conversation, but there's also just, you know, there's now, these sort of subcultures of thinking about, these encore years and shifting from your first career to your second career, your third career. And because we are living long enough, it's not like your life is over. You can, and those are like reboots. Like I've always wanted to write poetry, but I had to pay for, the bills and support my family growing up. And so, I was just doing business, and now I can do poetry. Now I can do community theater. And so there's all those possibilities as well. But, I think one kind of core element to all of that seems to be the social relevance, right? It's usually not like now I can finally make tons of money, with crypto coin. No, it's like it usually involves some aspect of contributing, the what is it you psychologists call generativity, the Erickson.
Yeah, I don't know. We wouldn't. Dave and I are like the last
Yeah.
people who would know
Yeah.
that. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's not the kind of psychology we're into.
We don't talk about that kind of
Yeah,
psychology on
Yeah.
the podcast.
exactly.
No.
Yeah. So, but the idea is
Self-actualization,
so,
is that the
Oh,
Maslow? That
I
was
think
the
that's the Maslow stuff.
yeah,
Yeah.
oh
which
yeah,
has an
yeah.
interesting history in Southern California hippie movements. But anyway, yeah, early,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Well, anyway, that was, I guess, going back to that original question about lessons and rethinking and sort of harnessing what we know and have learned about how we've lived over most of our evolutionary history can be insightful when we think about whether it's something like a heart disease like heart disease versus even just our general well-being and thinking about how to spend our later years.
Yeah. I think that's a really important and beautiful insight that we evolved to not want to be a burden on others, that we really fear and loathe a situation where we are taking in more than we are giving out. And we really value and appreciate situations where we are giving out more than we're taking in. And it makes, very clear evolutionary logic that if you're in a place where you're receiving more than you're giving, well, that's a really bad place to be in from an evolutionary perspective. That means that you are, if there's a famine or a flood or a drought or whatever, you're going to be the first to go. And that's not where you want to be from a Darwinian perspective. For the same reason, the opposite end of the continuum, where you are a vital resource to the community, where you're really valuable in providing crucial knowledge and services, that's a really good place to be from an evolutionary perspective. So it makes really a beautiful sense that we would have this kind of psychology. And I think it's an important point for people studying the psychology of well-being and what we ought to expect to be correlated with psychological well-being. Um, that said, I think I might have a bit more of a pessimistic take on the ability of us to continue to be valuable contributors into old age. I think there is something about the structure of our society that is preventing that from happening. I think our culture is changing way more rapidly than it has changed in ancestral environments, and I think the types of knowledge that are valuable to others have become way more specialized and nichified than they would have been in ancestral environments. So if I'm getting to old age now, the lessons and insights that I acquired during my youth are in all likelihood not going to be relevant to my children and grandchildren. They're going to be out of date. The
Mhm.
software I learned when I was a young person is probably going to be updated, and there are different, kinds of software now. They're going to be society will be different. Even the career I'm in, my dad's a lawyer, his advice for how to be a good lawyer that might not translate into being a good evolutionary psychologist. There's non-transferable knowledge between different domains of specialization, and even within his own realm of being a lawyer, I'm sure a lot of his knowledge and insight that was valuable when he was a young man is probably not as applicable to young lawyers entering the profession today, because we live in a very different legal environment, a very different cultural environment. We have the internet and social media, which has changed our society in innumerable ways. We have AIs that can write legal briefings now. So it's a completely different environment. And so I think we're living in an age where our elders have never been so worthless. Um,
Put
if you
that on
think
a
about
t-shirt. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I think we're at peak elders being useless. Okay, boomer, that mentality. really makes sense in terms of if you think about the economic structure of our society, and is really unprecedented because, as far as I'm aware, in most small-scale hunter, forager, horticultural societies, elders tend to receive a lot of respect and reverence, and they're looked to for wisdom and knowledge. In our society, it's quite the opposite. Old people are often ignored, dismissed. There's the okay boomer mentality. We're much more obsessed and excited by youth and what the young people are doing, and young people are cool and old people are not. It's a very different, unprecedented environment that we're living in, and I don't see a lot of ways to really change that without completely overhauling our economic system. So, what do you think about that pessimistic take?
Um, well, thanks for that question. I actually think that's a perfect representation. I think a lot of people might think. Um, and I have, yeah, a number of responses. First of all, even in hunter-gatherers society and from the ethnographic literature, in almost every society, you see some elements of, yeah, respect and honor for the elderly at the same time that you see sometimes poor treatment of the elderly. Just like in our society, we kind of think about old age as prestige and honor, but then youth-oriented, how do people actually get treated? So I think that sort of dichotomy has always sort of existed, and
Mhm.
that age itself doesn't necessarily get you anything, right? Going back to this idea about being useful, it's easy to focus on, the world leaders who are all, the average age of a world president, country president is like 62 right now. So, and that's an average. So there's, some that are, much older than that, but that they might not represent everyone in their age class, right? And so I do think going back to this idea about, okay, how can one be valuable and useful? And so even in hunter-gatherer societies, there is a point, in fact, maybe in the evolutionary world, because we're used to thinking about the grandmother hypothesis and these other ways that we can be adaptively, indirectly reproducing through care and other forms of resource transfers and such. But even with those arguments, remember, there's got to be a point at which your net transfers are zero, right? And that's when, if you're still alive, you're probably not going to be alive for very much longer. And there's various ways that people go from being alive to not being alive. And some of it includes actually direct geronticide, right? So from our cultural context, murdering old people doesn't seem compatible with respect and honor of the elderly. But in the actual context in which it occurs, it's actually, deeply personal experience. It's basically some of the same issues that we're dealing with now with
Mm.
euthanasia, and at what point is enough enough? And not just with terminal illness, right? But thinking about, okay, I'm done. Uh, so I think there is that element that has existed even in hunter and gathering contexts.
Mhm.
And then the next step of what I would say is there is a difference between thinking about people in their 90s and thinking about people even in their 60s. Because from what you're saying, my kids already think I'm old. Uh, what is my son was trying to trick me into doing 6'7" thing. Uh, right. So Dave doesn't even know it yet.
Yeah.
Your kid, if your kid was a little bit older,
Yeah.
you would know that, right? And so you're already obsolete in your 40s, and which
Totally.
which true, taking it to the extreme, it's not just the elderly who are obsolete, but we're obsolete by age 30, and
Yeah.
but I think right. And so it's true that the rate of population growth is highest at some of those latest ages, but just in terms of sheer numbers, the biggest chunk of like elder population is going to be in that young old category, right? So like 50 to 75, and that's still the age range that even in hunter gatherers people are contributing in valuable ways, right? And so I'm not really talking about, the people who are 95 need to kind of get out there and make a difference, and it's true that aspect still might carry more burden than benefit, that of course will depend on a whole bunch of factors, but it's not like everyone 60 and up is going to be all burden. So there's that element too, that I do think the ages matter. And so the kinds of things a 60-year-old can do might be very different than what a 90-year-old can do, given how we live today. And then the final point about all of that, yes, society is changing super rapidly and knowledge becomes obsolete very rapidly. But I think there's certain skills that even with ChatGPT and Wikipedia and rapidly changing norms and fads, that a little bit of wisdom and experience are just very valuable. And from just simple advice, to say your grandchildren, to even there's been sort of I don't know if I call it a movement, but Chip Conley and others sort of harness this idea that yeah, older people have a lot to contribute, but they can't do it by themselves. So bring them in as partners, working with some of the young folks who have, you know, much more, recent knowledge about, say, technology and the way things are working today, combined with some of the wisdom and experience of older folks. And then all of a sudden, it can make a huge difference. I mean, just even think about, some of your academic advisors. The academic climate today is a lot more competitive than when our advisors, just whenever they thought they would just like go onto the market and get a job and but you wouldn't probably say that your advisors still have nothing to contribute, given that the academic market has shifted. There's still a lot of wisdom and experience when it comes to the day-to-day type things. So I think we just need to be kind of creative and create those niches where there are still some contributions, but we can't necessarily expect the same exact contributions that we would expect probably from people in their 20s and 30s as we might expect for people in their 70s. Does that make sense? So,
Yeah.
you know, I, I still think at the end of the day, and there's been a lot of increasing activity towards even just like mentorship programs and things that trying to kill two birds, one stone. There's still plenty of literacy and, wayward youth that will get themselves into trouble. And then they're partnered with older adults, kind of mentorship programs, kind of like Big Brother, Big Sister, but with older adults that, not only reduces loneliness in older adults and gives them a sense of meaning and purpose by contributing to their community, but you're also, preventing future crime. You're improving literacy, improving their job prospects down the road. And those types of arrangements are win-win. But the better thing, even better would be like, well, is that only a volunteer thing? Like I still need to eat, and I can't rely on my Social Security and I don't have savings. And so, right, can we create a system where it's not necessarily for free, but that these things are monetized. There's, exchange economy. Uh, I just think we haven't really been thinking about those things nearly as much as what's the new miracle breakthrough that's going to extend my life to 150 years of age. And so, yeah, I guess I would say part of the shift with this book, by looking back, it's a way of looking forward, but focusing on different things. Maybe we're going to live to 150 through other folks doing their work, but that's not happening anytime soon. And given the world we do live in, how can we kind of maximize not just quantity but the quality of life? And part of I think the important bit too is that no one's really just altruistic towards older people, right? But the idea is that by integrating older people, you're actually helping everybody of all ages. And that's the idea.
Mm. Yeah, I like that. You're finding the value in people and respecting them, and it's not a handout. In the same way you said, people want to feel like they're actually contributing. I agree with David too. I think that's really profound because there's a lot of sort of rhetoric about we have to really be careful about the moral hazard of giving anything to anybody because
Hmm.
left unchecked, people will just want to be sponges. And it sounds like what you're saying is that that and that view is often framed as sort of like a very steel, open-eyed sort of no Pollyanna view of human nature, right? Where like people
Hmm.
will just free ride the hell out of things, and
Right.
that's actually human nature. And it sounds like what you're saying is that is an oversimplification, and in fact, people want to feel like they're contributing.
Exactly. And there's always going to be some small percentage of that. But that's easy to contain when you have the vast majority, paying their taxes basically, in a variety of different ways. And from so much of what, studies that have been done, we do know that people want to do more, but there's always obstacles.
Mhm.
I live in a place and I can't get to the elementary school. How am I
Yeah.
I can't drive anymore. How am I actually going to get there? And so again, this goes back to this urban planning
Yeah.
elements of, how many people there are with, with older people with big empty houses, and then you have all these like college students that can't
Yeah.
find a place to live.
Exactly.
It's like,
Exactly.
put the peanut butter with the chocolate.
Yeah. It's a
And
coordination problem. It's a coordination
mhm,
problem. Yeah.
yeah. But I think just having those conversations and brainstorming those things is the first step for really trying to help kind of implement that. And that's what I'm hoping happens with well, not just with the book, but as we kind of move forward. Um,
Yeah.
Well, at the beginning of the episode, you mentioned a really interesting and profound fact about the difference between modern civilization and what we see in small scale hunter, forager, horticulturalist societies, which is that fertility has gone down quite a bit
mm,
in the modern world.
mhm.
And you talked about, the pyramidal structure of society where, it used to be that there were relatively few old people and lots of young people because fertility was so high. But now we have more of a cylindrical or tower-like structure where
Yeah.
there's evenly distributed numbers of old people and young people because we're just not having as many kids. And from a Darwinian perspective, this is a really huge and important puzzle because you might expect the opposite from an evolutionary perspective, that in times of unprecedented wealth and abundance, you would expect fertility to boom, that we would be having more kids. And yet the opposite has happened. And, there's been tons of, empirical and theoretical work on this. It's known as the demographic transition. It's sometimes called a paradox. So I'm curious, given your knowledge of human development, human life history, human psychology, human health, do you have a take on this profound change in human population structure? Is there a particular theoretical approach that you favor? What is your take on this question?
Yeah. I guess, these days now, we've shifted from, worries about the population bomb and the population boom and to, population collapse, right? And so we're starting to see, uh, a lot of, op-eds, about this kind of thing. And of course, the Elon Musk's trying to, do their part. And, I think, um, well, on one level, the fact that you have a population pyramid like this, probably never before in history we had this many generations sort of coexistent, which is kind of cool. Like, wow, what are all the potentials? So it's not even just like grandparents with kids, it's like great grandparents, great great grandparents potentially. So so that's kind of wild in terms of thinking about those possibilities. There's economists and others who've kind of been working on, should we be as panicked as we are? Are we just being selfish by not wanting kids? I have a colleague who thinks we're selfish if we do want kids because of, R equals zero point 0.5. I was like, clearly that person's never had a kid because you know, um, but I do think, it's an older idea within sort of the evolutionary perspectives on the demographic transition, right? That we're not just built to kind of maximize the total number of babies, right? But in terms of, maximizing our sort of genetic income stream, uh, it is the, is it the case, or at least psychologically, that we feel that we need to provide in a certain way for kids? And so we don't seem to be hitting that diminishing returns on the few kids that we do have, right? So if we were, then you'd hit diminishing returns and you'd have another child. But coupled with the fact that it takes so much longer, like alpha in the evolutionary models, like the age of first birth, that's sort of the shift from growth to reproduction, right? But for us now, I mean, if that's happening at age 30, right, that's clearly beyond just somatic growth. That's, all that human capital in our brain, to the point where you are sort of economically somewhat independent. And then all of a sudden now you're having children. So you're already like way too late or not too, way too late, but later in the game. And then we don't seem to be having these diminishing returns. I do kind of think, this whole idea, it's not the right time, it's not the right time. My grandmother always used to say, it was never the right time. We just had kids. Like, that was just what we did. And so, is it that, we're all kind of stuck on this treadmill thinking that we need more schooling and we need to hit a certain level of well-being, economic well-being before we feel comfortable introducing a child into the world. And then what do we feel that child needs to have, and how can I afford that? Um, and so, I mean, certainly what people seem to say, when this was first happening in Italy and places where, you know, growth rates were declining rapidly, and the total fertility rates were well below replacement, well before it was hitting other countries. And it was this economic thing and the time thing just really, come up again and again and again. Uh, some people were blaming, well, this is what happens with, when you let women work, and they were throwing this weird spin of like gender equality is leading to fertility decline. But it sort of implies that, well, then left to your druthers to pick the best choices in life, that kids somehow become less and less a part of that story. Um, I also think, I don't know about you, Dave, but you know, I didn't have tons of experience with babies
Yeah,
until I had my
David's
own.
a father too. Yeah.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
David. How
David,
old is your?
how old, yeah, mine's 5.5.
She's 3.5.
3.5, yeah.
Oh, 3.5.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so yeah, there's a lot of like, oh, I'm not ready for this. That there were certain elements that were easy or much easier than I thought they would be, and then of course elements that were much harder, and of course because of the relatively isolated way we live, it definitely adds to the costs of raising children, and we're much less free range childhoods than we've ever been before, even in our compared to like when I was a kid. And all that just seems to raise the costs more. And so I do feel like there's there, it seems to be more psychological, explanations for why we're sort of tricked into uh, getting by with fewer children, even though all the data would show you could have more kids and they would still survive. But yeah, they might survive, but then where you do see some of the trade-offs is definitely how many of them are going to get college education, how many of them are going to be making a decent salary, by the time that they're 30. And there you do see the trade-offs that make like great quantity quality kind of arguments about fertility and investment. So, which is probably why there's, a small sector of like super wealthy who are increasing their fertility because they can farm out everything, right? From literally like your breasts, having wet nurses to, childcare to everything. Um, yeah, so that's I don't know, my quick, what is interesting is from having worked with small scale societies for a while where fertility has been always high. So with the Aceh, they had about average 7 births. The Chumane had about 8 births or 8 or 9 births over their life course. And it's true, not all survive, but a good number survive. And surrounded by kids all the time, you really get the sense that someone who's worthwhile, competent, has status, should have a family and have a big family. And so, me coming in with my college education and working towards my PhD and beyond, I was sort of seen as the poor person who doesn't really know how to be an adult. What are you looking for? Why are you even here? Like, yeah, we're just living our lives. And it's interesting because even, some of the Bolivians I'm good friends with who, are from the cities still have some of that mentality too, that family is key. There's certain decisions they wouldn't make they wouldn't move across the country to another country for a job, um, when there's all these sort of ties that bind and keep you local. So I don't know, I'm just veering off into La La Land here. Uh,
No, I
but
mean it's not La La Land. I mean, I think it showcases one area where I think it's crucial to take an evolutionary psychological approach rather than, say, a behavioral ecological approach, because here in this case we have a behavior that is clearly not maximizing fitness. And the only way to really understand it is to think about what's actually on inside people's heads.
yeah,
What are the emotions? What are the thought processes? What is leading to this outcome? Because it's clearly not maximizing fitness in a straightforward Darwinian sense. There must be some kind of mismatch between, say, ancestral selection pressures and the current environment. There must be something in the head that is causing these types of behaviors to emerge, and for that we need to delve into the psychology of social status, of passing social status on to our kids and making sure our kids are competitive in the social environment, what the social environment is like, what kinds of cues the mind is receptive to when it comes to planning out the life course and planning out their families. So it seems like what you're saying is that there's something about the way that social status and wealth is organized in modern societies that is feeding into our evolved minds and giving us cues that we really need to invest a lot in our kids in order for them to be competitive with other kids in the environment, and we just don't have the resources to have a large number of offspring because we can't make sure that each one of them is going to, say, go to college, become successful and prestigious. And the only way we can really have competitive children is if we invest tons of resources in those children. Is that basically
I think
the idea?
so. Well, in our children and potentially ourselves. And
Right.
Yeah,
so,
sure.
one kind of like unpublished paper number, 12 that, just never made it to light from years ago was trying to get at this exact question. And I was using like consumer data. So it's like, all right, if your income's increasing, well, what better way to kind of give us some insight into the mind? And what are you spending your money on? Like, there's only so much food you can eat, right? And so maybe you're not spending more money on food, but you're spending on other things. But you could maybe just spend it on food, but just much more expensive, high quality food. Um, and and what I was suspecting and what I ended up finding, yeah, it wasn't, yeah, there's more on food because you are now, well, you see a lot more meat come on and then organic meat and then, uh, each adjective you add to your food, adds a little bit more money that's spent. But it's more on sort of like luxury items and luxury, status oriented kinds of expenditures, which then all of a sudden, you see increasing much more dramatically. So yeah, it really seemed to be the case that like you could get by without having all of those things and just, save that money and put that towards another child. But it's this idea that, since status is such a positional good, right? It's always changing, and it could be very well that, given that we're social creatures and comparative creatures, the fact that our social world through social media and everything, we're level of comparisons are insane. And so will we ever reach diminishing returns? Because there's always going to be people out there that will have something that you don't have, or at one level a little bit better. And so it feels really hard to kind of get off that treadmill. And our expenditures seem to be going along with that. Our brains and our level of satisfaction seem to go along with that. So yeah, I do think it definitely is kind of a psychological kind of argument. But I think it's one of those perfect meshes of like behavioral ecology and evolutionary psychology, because the
Mhm.
certainly under more traditional natural fertility environments, maximizing status would have maximized fertility.
Yeah.
Right. In almost every traditional society, when you look at like how many cows and how much land, pretty much maps onto number of partners and number of children, almost everywhere. And it really is in this sort of heavy competitive post-capitalist kind of market economy where you really see that kind of shift.
Yeah.
Yeah, and even the decision, I mean, we talked a lot about structural issues. Germany was one of the places that had low fertility, and so parental leave and
Mm,
childcare became free completely, and there was an enormous uptick in people having kids.
mhm,
And the decision of sort of like, well, will I lose my job? Do I have the resources while I am a young adult to to uh, to have kids? That also feels like a very behavioral, ecological, but also
mm,
evolutionary psychological
yeah,
decision, because it really maps onto sort of like, you know, what's the ballistic trajectory of my ability to actually have a career or get the returns on my, intellectual investment.
mhm,
And then how much is having a child going to eat into that? And so I think this is another way where I think, in a funny way, at least anecdotally to me, many of the people who are opposed to things like like extending parental leave for, like, 7 months or a year or 14 months, or like free childcare for everybody. Like, many of the people who are against that are also the people who are super concerned about like plummeting fertility rates.
I know.
And I think that's absolutely silly because,
Yeah,
those are actually some of one argument would be that's one of the reasons for that.
yeah.
Yeah. And so I think, to my mind, this is another example of very much an evolutionary psychological um, problem, but but the solution is a structural problem. It's not wagging your finger at people and say, "Have babies, don't be an idiot." It's actually
Mm,
respecting the intelligence of not wanting to have a baby in the context of a concern about, like, am I going to be okay in my job? Like, do I have to leave, 3 months or 3 weeks of parental leave? I mean, it's like crazy, right?
mhm. Well, yeah. Well, some of that pushback I've heard is from people who would have wanted that when they were younger, but now they're older and they didn't have it.
Yeah, that's the
And
best argument. I
yeah,
didn't have it, so you can't either. That's a great way
well, right.
to,
And so it's like, why
yeah,
why should I have
that's,
my taxes go to subsidize other people's kids and the luxuries that I didn't have? There's that element too, I think, of people's psychology, where if you don't feel like you're part of a community, then you don't feel like you want to actually contribute to those people that you're not related to, but make for a better society, better economy, everything.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. David,
So
I feel like you're going to
we're
say something.
approaching the end of
Yeah.
the episode. Um, are there any topics that you're dying to cover, Dave, or that we haven't covered yet?
I mean, with Mike, so many that we're just
Yeah,
gonna have to have Mike on again. So yeah.
yeah,
So, but
probably.
yeah, yeah.
I'm kind of curious. I mean, I remember I was looking through your publications and I saw something on personality, which is a really interesting topic in evolutionary psychology that we haven't really talked a lot about. I don't think we've talked really delved into this topic in any of our episodes.
Hmm.
I know you have some thoughts on that. You have some interesting data showing that personality is very different in small scale forager societies. That we don't see the same kind of differentiation and so-called big five factors
Mhm.
in personality. So I'm curious what your take is on the evolution of personality, why we are so different in these patterned ways, why modern environments are showcase even larger differences between people in terms of their personalities than you might see in a small scale society, and what might be going on there.
Yeah. So if I can start from from the, I've never actually, I think, told this story about how I even got started thinking about personality because I certainly didn't set out to be that guy, like the one just
Hmm.
big five that's
Hmm.
doesn't exist here, and so you know it's someone a colleague once made a joke about they think I have like the same graph in every paper, where there's some y-axis, things that people in the West get, and then, as a function of age or whatever, and then like, it's always flat, like zero. It's like I just changed the y-axis label. And so it's like, yeah, big five. Look, that doesn't exist either. No, that was never actually the point. The point was just that actually, I was running, a big health and aging project, and you get to know people in these communities. So every data point is a person, and it just seems like we've got their age and all these biomarkers and all these other characteristics, but it doesn't seem to be capturing some element of them as a person that I know impacts whether they're even here showing up, whether they're going to actually take the meds that, we may have prescribed, whether they're conscientious and, some precautions that they might need to take or whatnot. And we weren't measuring that at all. And so this was really just me like, okay, let me just find a personality instrument and let's just kind of add it to our kind of circus of things we're trying to get at the individual level. Now, certainly I had some exposure to not so much, I'm not a personality psychologist, and I know the industry is quite large as I tried to, you know, pave my way into it a little bit. Um, and so it was interesting to me, from the behavioral syndromes kind of literature, right? That, oh, wow, from a behavioral ecologist perspective, if things are adaptive, and conditions are different, you should shift, right, towards whatever that local adaptive thing is. And, there could be obstacles, but the idea that, under variety of different conditions, you might act consistently. It's kind of an intriguing kind of concept. And so thinking about those repercussions and then what would that mean? And then, yeah, are there elements of certain folks seem very wide open, speak easily, they're extroverted. Are those people faring better differently than the folks who are more quiet, internalizing things and, um, all that kind of stuff. So I was like, all right, let me get a big five inventory. I found one that was in Spanish and it wasn't too onerous. I had like 40, 20, 40 items, I think. And it was just fun actually working with Chimane back and forth and trying to, uh, how do you translate this? And th this was like kind of an early preview of the fact that like there aren't words to describe all these nuances in personality. Now it doesn't mean it doesn't exist as a concept. You could describe it in a phrase or a sentence or two, but there wasn't like a single word kind of descriptor that would adequately kind of capture a lot of those terms. And so we did kind of translate it all. And, I'm always wary, if it's kind of new, it's strange, can people, respond well? We back translated, people kind of understood what was going on, but we also just recorded information about like the person who was doing the interview. would record whether the person would smile, were they, open with their words, or did they seem really quiet and reticent, and all that kind of stuff. And so not only did we find, we were able to kind of collect those kinds of data, it actually did map onto what people said. So the extroverted people, were rated as having being more talkative, more open, with their thoughts and talking about themselves and such. And then the people on the, emotional stability that were lower on that, um, the former N, the neuroticism, uh, those were less, a little bit less so. And so that showed that, I think we're actually collecting, real data because certainly the personality psychologist, as soon as you find something that's not big five, it's go straight for the methodological jugular, right? It's like it's a translation issue. It's, how do you know your instrument is measuring the exact same thing and blah blah blah. And part of the argument was like, well, I don't think it's measuring the exact same thing, but that's part of what we're actually, actually finding. So it was through the initial just designing that instrument in local language and trying to capture some elements of personality that might be relevant for thinking about health, economic activity, fertility, marriage, all these things. But as the initial sort of exercise of like, let's just do the PCA and get the big five, and I was like, oh, wait, that's not really a big five by any means. And then it was like sort of going through all these different lengths. Well, what if we just focused on the people who speak Spanish, maybe, or who are educated? Maybe they would act differently. And, what about instead of, David, you rating yourself, I have Dave rate you. Okay. And see if that, so we did all these different permutation, all these different ways, and yeah, people are somewhat agreeable. So you can ask the question in the negative, and we had agreeableness checks, did all of that, and basically we didn't really have a big five. What we called it loosely like a big two. That seemed to be like there's sort of industriousness and like prosociality seemed to be kind of two dimensions. And and some of the initial ideas were kind of laid out in that initial paper, but that was probably one of the hardest papers to write because it was selling it to, what was it? Not Psych Science, but JPSP,
Mm.
the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. So it was kind of like playing with the big boys of psychology, and personality, and trying to convince them that, hey, I think I have something to say, and having to learn their tools and language. Uh, but it was from that initial exercise that I didn't really think it was, well, because I was a little nervous, like maybe it really is just a translation thing or something I'm doing wrong. And it wasn't that you can't get measures for the each of the big five, right? It's this weird thing about thinking about the personality structure itself, right? That basically, uh, if they were like five bands on a equalizer, they still have equalizers on radios. Uh,
Yeah, I mean they're virtual now, but yeah,
yeah,
the
okay.
garage. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Instead of each of those moving really independently, it's kind of like if you were to move it, they would be stuck and a couple will be moving together. And so, yeah, what it does mean is in terms of the combinatorics, you'd have a less diversity of personalities out there. Whereas if you had more independent factors moving, more possibilities, you can get more different ways of being. And so, certainly, the initial ideas were just like, well, it seems to be the case that in Chimane life and probably a lot of other, similar groups, there's all different types of personalities, but at the same time, there's certain limits and constraints over how you can act around other people. Um, like there's no computer programmers, right? You can't just be like a genius that holds up and does your own thing if you're not socially competent enough to interact with other people.
Hmm.
And so it just got me thinking about sort of niche space of modern societies in contrasting with small scale societies. Uh, and the easiest thing to think about was just like jobs, right? But certainly the idea and why we, I think, called it socio-ecological complexity or something was to move beyond just thinking about jobs, but jobs are an easy thing to kind of measure, or how many products, your society is producing. And and so with the idea that if there's many more different ways to make a living, then sort of like in the old ecological theory, individuals will sort of like fill up that niche space until there's sort of diminishing returns and look elsewhere. You get what, the ideal free distribution. And so all the niche space gets kind of filled up. And so what's sort of determined though is what does the niche space actually look like? And so the initial approach we had was just using country level data and taking personality data and just looking at the sort of correlation structure across the different big five, with the idea that if it's a high correlation, then even though, again, you get the big five measures, they're sort of hanging together. In the simplest case, it's all one, right? If correlation is one, versus if it's zero and they're completely uncorrelated. But the idea is like, what could you look at the country level that would give you some insight into like that sort of niche diversity? And we looked at a variety of different things from sort of like GDP, like proxies like GDP, gross domestic product, to like, you know, these like economic portfolio indices that like apply these entropy terms for like how many different products does your country make and what's the relative abundance of them,
Hmm.
right? So, with the idea that more products comes from more jobs, and that sort of uh, hierarchical structure where you're going to require lots of different types of jobs and different types of ways of being. And so the idea was that with more jobs and more niche space, that your equalizer is like the preset that maybe like makes you a little bit better at one thing than another. And so the idea was kind of attractive. We did some number of empirical analyses that actually all showed, some nice correlations that uh, that personality structure, even in places where there's supposedly, big five, that the overall correlation varies, and it varies in a way in relation to the niche diversity, such that where there's a more diverse set of niches, you see less correlation between those factors. In other words, more ways of being, of personality. Um, so that was the initial kind of empirical set of observations. And then, of course, part of what I like to do is like, all right, there's some results. Now let other people think about how that could actually come to be. But we actually did do some modeling with Paul Smaldino. Uh, could something like that actually come to exist in a sort of processed way? And we did find some kind of consistent support for that. It was a fun exercise. There were all these new directions that would be really interesting to kind of think about that I just haven't kind of returned to. But I was sort of hoping, because part of it was also, again, that we just don't know that much about personality measured in small scale societies. So it was sort of all new. Luckily, there have been some more recent versions of things, and they might not be getting a big two, but they seem to be getting a similar kind of story that, there's not as many factors as you might think, and that maybe it varies in relation to that. But to me, yeah, the developmental story would be really amazing, right? You can think of all these, parents coming from, you know, small scale society context and now moving to the big city. How are children developing? What are the inputs that sort of shape and bring things out? Because what does it even look like at the individual level as opposed to, the construct we were using with a population structure, right? It's really the correlation structure of these personality dimensions. I still think there's elements of all those items that you see in people, but again, it's really how they kind of co-vary in people. And maybe when you kind of there's the niche diversity elements. we didn't really kind of test so much this idea about constraints, right? Or if you're purely egalitarian in a way that everyone can be however they want to be, maybe that releases the shackles a little bit as well. Anyway, it was a fun kind of foray into personality psychology that to me I was like trying to bring some evolutionary kind of perspective. What blew me away, I just sort of assumed that you guys had all worked it all out, right? That like, and then the fact of the big five is just it's just this big inductive exercise, right? It's just a
Yeah.
description.
Yeah.
And it must be true because it exists everywhere, but there's no theory that actually generates the big five. It's like,
You
wow.
just described all, literally, you'll read things of like, this thing must be true because there's so much data for it. And that is the cycle of just tautological looking under
Yes.
the lamp, or yeah,
I
the
mean, it's
Yes.
not a
telescope.
bad place to start.
No,
You need
no,
data,
of
you need
course. Yeah, yeah.
results, but then there, yeah, we just need more people, maybe not coming from the center of the discipline or sub-discipline to, shake things up a little bit. And so, yeah, I'm hoping that I haven't actually checked too recently to see if others have kind of been building
Yeah.
upon some of those ideas, but it'd be fun.
Yeah. And just to make that concrete, the idea of like a developmental thing would be, for example, something of like, if there's a child coming from a more egalitarian society, there's almost like software in the child to sort of be like, do I have to be as conscientious as my parents? Like it's sort of looking out in the world and sort of being like, could I actually get by with, and not maybe consciously, but somewhere in the software of sort of being maybe a little more of an asshole or being a little less conscientious. And I still see people who are more conscientious than my parents getting by. And I see my parents sort of getting the sucker's payoff of being too conscientious in the
Mm.
social or ecological niche now.
Yeah.
And so the idea would be there's like really software in the mind of every generation to sort of be like, is this a savvy way to make a living? Like, what's the way to
Mhm.
be a person, right?
Right. And of
Yeah.
course, it's relative to the particular social group that you happen to be a part of. So, what is the norm for conscientiousness or
Yeah.
neuroticism within my particular peer group is going to be different than what the norm is in a different peer group. And as soon as you get more fractionation and more, diversity of peer groups, you get different local averages and local norms, and that allows this greater diversity of social niches. So, what might be a profitable personality in one social group will be a different type of profitable personality in a different social
Yeah.
group. And as long as you get more and more subcultures and more divisions of people finding these niches, you get more diversity in the expression of personality. It's sort of
That's,
one
I think it's
analogy.
exactly
Yeah,
right. And,
yeah,
and that's essentially when we say urbanization, it's sort of like this
yeah.
proxy for this like flowering of all these like niches and sub niches that, you just don't really see that in very small scale societies. It's a limited kind of niche set.
Yeah, I mean, an analogy that I have in my head, and you can tell me if this is a bad analogy, is maybe at the heyday, the dawn of television, there weren't as many genres. Maybe it was just like
Mm.
comedy and drama, that was it. But now that we have all these streaming platforms, and it's so easy, we have this proliferation and abundance of different platforms, different ways of entertaining ourselves, and it's so much easier for weirdos to like find their weird audience. We have so many more genres now. It's not just comedy, it's like dark comedy and animated comedy. We have sci-fi and fantasy and, all these different types of entertainment that are enabled because of the economic structure of our society. And you could make a similar argument that we get more genres of people when you have a more variegated social environment where it's easier for people to find like-minded people and gravitate toward subcultures that have more of their type of personality in them. Like I can hang out with a nerdy subculture, and that's kind of an unprecedented thing. Like in an
Yeah.
ancestral small-scale environment, I probably could maybe find, I don't know, maybe one or two other nerdy people like me, but in the modern world, I can basically enter a job that is specifically selecting for nerdy
Yeah.
people and surround myself with nerds in a way that's kind of unprecedented, and that will probably bring the nerdy aspects out of me much more than that would have brought out of me if
Yeah.
I was in a different social context. So yeah, it's fascinating stuff. You yourself, Michael Gurven, have carved out a wonderful niche for yourself in the academic subculture. Uh, it has now come to the time in the interview where we ask you if there's anything you wish we had asked you.
Oh. Um, yes.
that we should have asked you, or that we neglected to mention?
But then if I anything I mentioned, are you going to turn around and ask me it?
Well, I think we
Do you want
probably
us
have to.
to?
Well, it depends if you.
No, you don't have. No,
Oh,
actually, we
no.
don't. There's no rule. So yeah, you
Oh,
could just
man.
say it and then just drop
Well,
the
no,
mic,
I guess
or we could talk about what the thing you wanted us to ask you that we could talk about another time. That's yeah, that's one thing.
yeah. Well, I guess it wasn't that I wanted you to ask, but I guess I was wondering, thinking whether you're going to ask about, the future of evolutionary social science, those kinds of,
Mm, yeah.
Hmm.
uh, those kinds of things, or something about the future of small scale societies and what is work going to look like moving forward. Uh, and is that going to kind of largely still be housed within like anthropology departments, or is that diffusing across, different places? And, as the divides between small scale and large scale, are those dissipating? And since groups everywhere are changing, and what does that mean? What's the untapped opportunity? I definitely think that, there is definitely value for like relatively, unacculturated, remote human societies. But as groups are kind of going under various degrees of changes on all fronts, I feel like it's a laboratory for asking so many interesting questions in all of our disciplines, and everything about the mind and behavior. In fact, almost everything that was mentioned today, has implications. And like David, you were asking about the decline in fertility. People are starting to shift and think about fertility. A lot of Chimane girls have Depo-Provera, injected in their arms now, and they're thinking about, should their kids be going to school, and not just like fifth grade education, but now the possibility for high school education or even beyond. So yeah, all these kinds of questions are fascinating to explore in these kinds of changing worlds, but focusing on the change rather than, well, sometimes I feel people feel they need to hide the change, right? Because they're trying to portray the sense that groups have been sort of untouched. And because that's what in the evolutionary world, what they expect people to want to hear about, and so I think that aspect kind of needs to shift a little bit, and it'll be really fun to think about, well, what would that look like if, what kinds of questions could we ask and all that.
Mm.
Anyway, yeah, that's what I thought you were going to ask. That's okay. You haven't. You don't have to ask it
There's
now.
a job. Yeah, that was a great set of questions. If you want a job as a co-host, you've where we're just like, talking about, I don't know what, nerds in Germany. I don't know. We're useless, but yeah. No, that's great. And actually that sounds like we should have we should like apply for funding for a conference or something about that or workshop. That sounds like a fun thing to do.
Yeah, I
Something
mean,
like,
maybe that's what we should do. We should have a dedicated episode on the future of evolutionary social science. I know a number of our guests
Oh yeah, yeah.
expressed an interest in that
Yeah.
topic. I
We
think
just
it'll be
had
cool.
Brett Bayheim on, and I think somebody alluded to him giving a talk about the end of Hunter or egalitarian or, Hunter. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but we didn't even get a chance to ask him that because we were
hmm.
like again, like idiots, we're talking about his whiteboard, So yeah, we're still
Well,
working on this. Yeah.
you're right. You were right about 2 hours flying by, and I feel like
Yeah,
we barely got started.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
But Mike, thank you so much for coming on. Really, personally, you were really important for me in grad school. I took a class with you. I'm back now as professor, but like you really introduced me to like the behavioral ecology, human behavioral ecology. I still have the textbook, the Smith and Winterhall. They're
Oh,
90. Um, it's a
the Green
great
Bible.
book.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great book where you just sort of quantify things in a way that I never knew you could do. And it was just, it was revealing. And so, for anybody who doesn't know about human behavioral ecology or Mike's work, please check it out. It's just, it's an incredible list. Mike talked about like 12 papers that didn't see the light of day, and that sounds like a lot, but it's because he's got so many that did see the light of day. It's actually the percentage is probably the same as everyone else's, if not smaller. So, and then Mike, the book comes out on September 16th.
16th.
Okay, so
Yeah.
we'll hopefully this episode will be coming out September 16th, and then where can people get the book?
Well, I know it's available on Amazon and Target for some reason.
Okay.
I'm hoping it'll be available, your local bookstore, maybe go beforehand and ask them to make sure they have it in.
Yeah.
It can be also ordered through the Princeton University Press website. And if you put PUP30 as a little code, you'll get 30% off.
Whoa.
Although
Hey,
that
that's
I don't know if that will disappear the 16th, but I know
yeah.
pre-ordering that uh, you can get a 30% discount.
Wow, that's our first real ad. That's cool. That's a very, very
Sorry,
good, very
did
good, very
not want it
good.
to be me. I'm like the least adept at
No,
marketing
no,
that
this is great. This is great. But no, it's a really great, and I am really glad that you're doing this kind of thing because yeah, I think there's so many snake oil salesmen who are
Mm,
trying to sell snake oil, which is why they're called snake oil salesmen. But anyway, like, and I'm glad that like actual scientists are venturing into these formats of what is the lifespan like.
great. Well, thank you. I really enjoyed this, and thanks for doing what you do. I think this is a lot more productive way to get people excited about ideas, and it's great what you're doing.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
David, good to see you. Yeah, and David, Mike, we'll have to have you on again to talk about all a whole other set of things that you're doing. So, but this is wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yep. Thank you. Take care.
You too. Well, David, I start. Let's start over. Okay. You start. I lost it.
Well, we did it. We did another episode. It was fun. The guest had a good time, I'm assuming. You had a good time, I'm assuming. And you, the listener, probably had a good time. Well, you must have if you're still listening.
Yeah, I
Uh,
mean, the guests really make the episode. I mean, I think we just sort of, stumble around and get in their way occasionally. But we provide the Zoom, so but yeah.
yeah, we pick good guests. I mean, that's our
Oh,
rules. We pick
that's a
really
more
good.
positive way to put it. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
okay.
So,
I'll go with that. Yes, we pick great guests. Yes, our guests are
um,
wonderful.
yes. And if you're happy with our picks, please say so on social media. Leave us a kind review. Check out our Patreon page. And if you have any ideas for other guests or other topics that we should cover or general feedback, please
Mm.
let us know.
Or other formats. Yeah,
Yeah. Who knows?
so
Maybe we should interview a chair,
like a person who has the job of being a chair of a department, or like actually interview a chair, like a
like
in
a
an
physical
analogy.
chair. We interview the chair. Uh,
Like sort of between two ferns sort of vibe,
yeah, except
like a chair roast.
except the chair is between two people, and yeah,
Oh, interesting. All right, well let's workshop this. I like this idea. Okay,
yeah,
maybe next week we'll hear from a chair? Question
yeah.
mark. Okay. Interesting, David. Okay, very interesting. Okay, we'll see you next week.
All right, see ya.